Hey everybody, it's Matt. I hope things are going awesome in your world. Thank you for hanging out with me on my YouTube channel, where last time around in the previous video, you and I went and checked out Old St. Patrick's Catholic Church in Chicago, Illinois. And that has got to be one of the most beautifully cohesive, on-brand, thematically unified churches I've ever seen in terms of art and architecture and clarity of purpose in terms of when it started, clarity of purpose in terms of right now. There's something very special going on there. And I want to talk about that a little bit as we get into this. If you haven't seen that previous video, you're going to be just fine sitting in on this one, catching up with me, but you should definitely go watch that previous video. This is a neat church and we had a great host there. And I got to take my son, which is awesome. So let's start with Kara, the lady who showed us around. I was so impressed with, just from the get-go, with her deep reservoir of knowledge on all of this stuff: church, ministry, philosophy, theology, the Bible, how Catholicism works, art, architecture, Irish history, Chicago history. It was so apparent to me that she was able to dip the bucket in to that deep well and draw out as much as she wanted. But rather than doing that, to be like, I know so many things, instead, she just pull out just enough to answer my questions and leave me curious to learn more. I'm going to mix a metaphor here, but to see if I wanted to pull on that thread a bit more. And I think that's a remarkable aspect of people's character. And when I run into people like that, I'm struck by it. I admire that in people. I also admire and appreciate the way she handled the fact that my son was with me on this trip. That's unusual for me. Usually I don't get to take my kids. Sometimes it works out. Again, I don't remember if I mentioned this in my last video or not, but my son and I had already filmed a whole very elaborate church tour in the Chicago suburbs earlier that day. And he's a little kid. He's tired. He's a good sport, and he's not the kind who'll drag around and whine ever. That's not his routine. I want to give credit where it's due. But he was tired, and that's okay. And she could detect that a little bit. And I thought she was immediately sensitive to that. She was empathetic, but also she was empathetic to me and the dynamic of a dad and his son. She knows, she could tell I'm trying to do mentoring and spiritual formation with my kid. I'm trying to pass along a cohesive, biblical, historically rooted understanding of Christian faith and theology. I want my child to walk with God, and I want that to be sustainable. I want it to be an understanding of the character of God and the historic Christian faith and his relationship with the church, which will be up and down. There's no way to outmaneuver that with parenting. And so I'm trying to get him ready for the difficulties that come with being in any human community, including the community of Christians. He'll get hurt there. He'll probably hurt people there, but also God will serve him and give him the elements of grace and nourish him through the course of his life there. I mean, where else can you go? Who else has the words of life, right? So there's this very complex equation that I'm running with how I'm trying to impart and build up Christian faith in my kids. And I felt like Kira saw that in an instant. It took nothing for her, even with the camera rolling, to see what the dynamic was and to be really thoughtful about it, and to be thoughtful not just about a video that a whole bunch of people were going to watch, but to be thoughtful about what this guy is doing with his kid. And so every time we got to a place in our conversation where, because she is drawing on a deep well of knowledge on this material, she could tell that we might have different convictions or our traditions might function a little differently, she would come at it just a bit differently, with a little bit of empathy, a little bit of extra explaining. She wasn't looking at my son, but I could tell she was framing it so that he would get it and she wouldn't undercut what she assumed I was trying to build into his life. That's really thoughtful and very multifaceted. I was also very impressed with what a great job she did of pointing out the unity of the design and the art, the motifs in this church. I have seen more splendid, magnificent churches in Protestant, Orthodox, and Catholic traditions. But that's not what they were going for. That's not the money they had. That's not the audience who they were trying to connect with. The audience is kind of a crass way to put it. That's not the Christians. It's not the community that they were trying to connect with when they built this thing. When they built this thing, the Irish were sort of social outsiders in this country. We completely forget that. At this point in our modern social warring and weird conversations that we don't really know how to have about race and ethnicity in the country, hopefully we'll figure that out and learn those dance steps together sooner than later. But we just don't even think of Irish or Italians as being anything other than just, mainstream European white America. But they were outsiders big time in the 19th century, maybe even into the early 20th century. And back then in cities, you'd have pockets of people from different countries from the old world, and churches would crop up that would particularly serve that. Even here in the Black Hills of South Dakota, where I live by Mount Rushmore in the mountains in western South Dakota. And up here, there's a mining town where they dug a hole practically to the middle of the earth to get all the gold out. And this little town is called Lead. And even in Little Lead, up at basically a mile high, this little mining town in the mountains has got like 20 ethnic neighborhoods that had 20 little ethnic grocery stores and even little mini churches that are mostly now totally defunct that served each of these different ethnic communities who were brought here by the gold. So it's not that long ago that this is how our country was, that this is how our cities, our boom towns functioned. And so it's very interesting when you go and see those institutions that still exist from yesteryear like that, in this case, a Catholic church. Well, like she said many times, the neighborhood changed. There's a wave of German immigration to that neighborhood. Germans who came to the United States in the mid-century, I mean, come on, you know your history. There's some serious pressures going on there. And if somebody was immigrating here, they were probably coming from a very difficult situation and leaving under very difficult circumstances, who are, there still would have been cultural memory amongst the Irish of what it was like to come here and try to set up shop in Chicago. So these Germans show up, and this church had the wisdom and the vision to be like, we should look out for our neighbors. We should help them out. And they did. And they even painted over some of their art to try to accommodate them in some almost overly dramatic expression of that biblical principle of not causing your brother to stumble, of showing care to, at least in that moment, the weaker brother, or the Christian brother or sister who are in the weaker, more vulnerable position. That really struck me when Kara was talking about that moment. And then when the moment passed, they took down the paint and the plaster and they re-exposed this beautiful art that is reflective of a distinctly Celtic Irish heritage. That Celtic heritage thing, Celtic Christianity in the grand historical sense of things, that's awesome. And it's something that should be beautiful to everyone who appreciates all world global heritage, especially all of the diverse heritage of the Christian church on every continent with every tribe, tongue, and nation. Well, the Celts are one, the Irish are one of those. And there was this amazing missionary movement that happened. Some of the big names were Columba and, of course, St. Patrick, and these missionary outposts on the frontiers of the world, the edges of the gradually fading Roman Empire in the middle of the first millennium. These happen, and I mean these woad blue paint pagan warriors of the north who Rome couldn't even handle. Along comes Christian faith, and it softens their hearts, and something changes there that changes the entire trajectory of these people from the great north. And the art that they produce in infusing their own history and their own imagery, and even capturing some of their old imagery and realizing, hey, this points us toward the Trinity. This points us toward the one true triune God. They're making these artistic discoveries in the 500s, 600s, 700s BC. And this beautiful artistic tradition is happening that makes things like the Book of Kells, which is a cultural treasure. If you're somebody who cares about human history and art, it's a remarkable treasure. And it's a time capsule of the artistic stylings of a distant version of the Irish people that can be carried forward all the way to now. And the fact that an artist took the time to go look at that book, and I can picture the little, sketchbook, and I can picture him jotting down these symbols and images, pointing out these things that Irish Christians from more than a millennia ago looked at and were like, we've had this image in front of us forever. And now we see how it points us toward the one true God. He dedicated clearly years, like all of the empty space and spare room of his thought to doing something that would be a magnificent, unified artistic achievement. The goose motif, the points to the Holy Spirit. I've marveled at the inlaid stone depicting all of that. It's beautiful. The windows up above that have panels straight out of the four Gospels of the book of Kells. The shape of the sanctuary and the pews in the sanctuary, the imagery on the end of each pew, the stained glass, everything about it from the moment you walk in says, yes, this is a church that is descended from one particular thread of Christ's church, one particular ethnic national thread of Christ's church. But in tracing this thread, we don't become fixated on it. We're reminded that there are a billion threads like this as the church has gone, the gospel has gone all over the world. And in Christ, all of these threads weave together. And here's one that is strong and intact and clearly traceable all the way back to when the gospel showed up to the people represented here in the first place. And the thematic unity of this church has really stuck with me. I found it very moving. Admittedly, I'm biased because I got the Irish in me, I got the Scottish in me, I got the Viking in me. So those kind of motifs and that kind of art, for whatever reason, it really resonates, as I'm sure art from wherever you're from does for you as well. It's because stuff means stuff, and it does get in the blood a little bit. So the other thing I really appreciated about this video was despite this church visit is despite all of that stuff I just said, there is still that closing remark from Kara about looking forward.
Our offices are actually on the top 2 floors of a building that we share with the archives of the Archdiocese. And so that's like a metaphor for us of like, it is great to look to our past, but if we're not careful, if we continue to look at our past, we will become the next 2 floors of the archives. So we have to look forward. We have to see what the needs are now and how do we serve the people in the city. And so, yeah.
The archives matter, the stuff we've done, where we've come from. Obviously, hold on to that story, and the gospel is in that story. Why the church exists is in that story. But I really appreciated how she wrapped it up by looking forward. And also, we need to figure out how that story informs what we do right now with our moment on the stage of history, with our moment where we hold the baton of the gospel and the message of the church. And I was impressed and moved and challenged just by that simple little thought at the end, that forward-looking attitude that she modeled in those closing remarks. And I'm stirred by that. And it makes me want to keep thinking more all the time about how much I appreciate all the things that make up my story and my tradition story and where we're coming from, but also to appreciate the opportunity that we're here right now and there's kingdom stuff to do and be a part of right now. And maybe there are a whole bunch of allies out there for that who for too long we have kept at bay because we think we can't agree on enough things. Maybe now in the age of the internet, it's a little bit easier for us to appreciate each other, appreciate the commonalities in those threads of the story, and appreciate that those threads may be different and distinct from each other, but they're also woven tightly together to make this bigger thing that is the grand historic Church of Christ that you and I participate in as Christians. Pretty cool. A lot to think about. Thank you for checking out that church with me. Thank you for always being willing to let me sit and reflect. Obviously, there's not a lot of editing that happens in videos like this. I just want to think about what I saw because this isn't an information dump for me. It's not like I know all the answers. I'm going to these churches kind of because I want to learn and I want to think and I want to be pushed and I would like to be useful. I want to be an agent for this thing, this kingdom that I think is the truest, realest thing. And you indulging me conversations like this is really meaningful. I appreciate it. All right. I think that's plenty for this time around. I'm Matt. Thanks for hanging out with me on my YouTube channel. Let's do this again soon.